Hello. In this episode, I want to try and throw some light on some economic terms that we hear so much about and which have far reaching effects on our lives as Africans and as members of a global community. To help us understand terms like neoliberalization and globalization is Dr. Peter Osimiri, a philosopher and political theorist who lectures at the University of Lagos in Nigeria. Dr. Peter Osimiri is passionate about applying abstract philosophical ideas to practical human problems. He holds a doctorate from the University of Ibadan, also in Nigeria, as well as a certificate in applied ethics from the Central European University in Hungary. With a broad background in philosophy and politics, his interest in issues of justice and human development is reflected in his research, which covers a wide range of areas including ethics, political philosophy, bioethics, and environmental philosophy. Please welcome Dr. Peter Osimiri. Good morning, Dr. Peter Osimiri. Yeah. Please, can you explain to us in a layman's language the meaning of the word liberalism and also globalization? I think both of them go hand in hand.
Okay, maybe I should start with globalization. When I hear the word globalization, a few concepts come to mind. Those are integration, interconnection, and interdependence. So you might say that globalization is the increasing integration of societies across the world along economic, cultural, and political lines. But I think that economic liberation is the most important because it's the one that is generating most of the controversies that you see around globalization. Neoliberalism actually is a dominant economic ideology in the age of advanced capitalism. Dominant because the socialist alternative actually went away with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so it simply says that societies that want economic growth and want prosperity must submit, so to speak, to the demands of market forces. In other words, they should allow market forces to make most of the economic decisions that needed to be made. They should allow for flexibility of labor, and they should also allow for the state to be rolled back from provisioning of social services so that the market takes, predominance within the society.
In other words, in countries that are supposed to be running a democracy, we're supposed to take responsibility away from the government elected by the people and then give authority to the market. Authority to do with our welfare, schooling, and all of that. So, who is this market, or what is this market?
Market forces actually is the manipulation of certain agencies trying to manipulate how things are distributed and consumed around the world. Now, to talk about the democratic aspect, that's very true that indeed, when you abdicate, I think I like to use the word, when states abdicate the space of making economic decisions to market forces, they simply allow undemocratic forces to take control of a charge of society.
How is liberalism different from neoliberalism?
Liberalism actually it's different from neoliberalism, even though they are connected in a way. They are connected in the sense that ultimately neoliberalism takes its roots from classical economics, and then the fact that there's an interest in freedom. But the difference is that while liberalism, it's a political philosophy that puts a lot of premium on and individual liberty and equality. the liberal is of the opinion that we must arrange the society in such a way that it promotes individual liberty. So a liberal most likely will endorse democracy because that will both promote individual liberty and equality at the same time. But neoliberalism is different in the sense that the interest of neoliberalism is on the freedom of capital and market forces. It wants a situation where we can have unfettered operation of market forces and, of course, capital. So the basic difference, why both are interested, both ideologies are interested in liberty. One wants to promote the liberty of the individual, while the other wants to promote the liberty of market forces and, of course, capital. What is interesting about governance is that there are different areas where governance takes place.
Okay.
You can govern the economy. You can govern the polity. You can govern, perhaps even your health system has to be governed. So when it comes to governing the economy, they're asking for government to roll back in that area, in that space, and then for market forces to step in. And interestingly, the market forces and those behind it are not in any way elected because there is no neutral market forces anywhere. There are people behind market forces. There are individuals behind market forces. For instance, there are buyers cartel, there are sellers cartel who can ultimately affect the pricing of certain commodities. So don't let anybody buy the idea that there's a neutral market somewhere that does all these things. The truth of the matter is that states are being asked to roll back from providing social services, social amenities, from delivering social services so that the market forces can take over. Interestingly, that actually creates a room for, capitalists to maximize their profit when the state rolls back and they step into the role of the state.
Now, so how did the neoliberal ideology begin, and how did it become so widespread?
The neoliberal agenda, actually, if I follow David Harvey, um, actually can be traced back to the 1970s, where there was the oil shock, and that's because the OPEC countries decided to quadruple the price of oil. And so Arab nations made a lot of money. That includes Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and of course, UAE. Now, some of these monies eventually found their way into banks in America. And these banks took this money because that became some sort of business for them. America actually was in some form of economic distress at this time. And so these banks took the money and they borrowed third world countries around the world with very high interest rates. Of course, they had to keep servicing this debt. And at some point in the 80s, Mexico declared bankruptcy and said it couldn't pay, or services debts anymore. In fact, it's not going to pay anymore. And of course, a number of countries, followed suit. And when this happened, the American government had to move in because that creates a very big problem to them. There was a potential that the international financial system was going to collapse on the basis of this. And of course, that these banks also will go down, and the US didn't want this to happen. So it literally moved to the IMF and said, IMF, please get into the fray and help us, ensure that these monies are paid back. And when the IMF moved in, it came up with a number of conditions that they call conditionality. The conditions will include liberalize your economy. In other words, open up to international competition, remove the barriers. It includes taking away subsidies from some goods. It also includes you privatizing and devaluing your currency. So these countries who were indebted were forced to do this, not that they imposed these policies on them. And the countries who had to reschedule their debt also have to, take on these prescriptions. They have to abide by them. And interestingly, this also began to spread, or in other words, neoliberalism began to spread because more countries at some point needed the aid of the IMF. And as soon as you ask for loans, you have to accept also to abide by those conditions. And this is how it began to spread as more nations had to come say we need loans from the IMF.
And therefore, African countries, colonized countries, the situation was even more pathetic because at independence, from my knowledge, um, most um, most colonizers were forced the countries that they were given independence to collect loans which they then directed what the money should be spent on and where it should even be spent. So, for instance, if France was giving a loan to an African country that they used to colonize, or England or Britain, they determined that whatever we bought with that money should be bought in Britain, so that that money went back into their system. And so we had even been in debt even before this oil thing happened. So it was, uh, so our debt was more compounded. You know, am I right in assuming that?
That's correct. And
Because
I think that's part of a strategy. There's part of a strategy of the colonial interlopers. One of my professors said, don't call them masters, call them interlopers. That's one of the strategy of the colonial interlopers to keep this country, under subjugation and exploitation. These countries have gotten flag independence, and it is a character of colonialism, which now expresses itself in neocolonialism to
mm,
ensure that you see tie these countries to the upper springs of their XY colonial interlopers. And of course, so the whole idea was to ensure that they still have some control over these nations who are borrowed money, who are African countries.
so these so-called world organizations, IMF, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, World Trade Organizations, what is their role in pushing this agenda, the neoliberal agenda and globalization, and why?
Let me begin with the answer why. What is very clear is that the neoliberal project is one that will give undue advantage to some nations, and of course, with disadvantage a number of nations. As a matter of fact, some have defined neoliberalism as an imperialist project that is intended to perpetuate the dominance of certain countries. It's intended to concentrate wealth in the hand of certain international political bodies, countries, and investors at the expense of the rest of the world. And so it's clear why this has been done. WTO, for instance, tells you we want free trade, remove all the barriers to free trade, allow trade to just flow across the nations. But that's a rhetoric. What happens in reality is that when you say free trade, you actually create a situation where there is unfair trade. Because when you have two unequal trading partners involved in the trade, it's so clear where the advantage will go. And apart from that, even when there's so much noise about free trade, there are certain concessions that are given to very powerful nations of the world that allows them to determine whether they want to get certain products from some parts of the world. So it's some kind of protectionism that is actually put up by this nation. So there is really no free trade anywhere. What you're having there is actually a trade system that is skewed in the favor of very powerful nations of the world. So that way, the neoliberal agenda is actually fostered and promoted. And then when you come to the World Bank and the IMF, these are countries that want to provide loans for economically distressed nations, but these nations have to accept their conditionalities. And these conditionalities, interestingly, actually are the ones that makes it easier or actually tends to perpetuate the dominance of those capitalist advanced superpowers of the world because look at some of the policies. You devalue your currency. If I devalue my currency, immediately disposable incomes is lowered. Immediately, the price of goods goes up because many of these goods are actually produced with inputs from raw materials from overseas, which have to be bought in dollars. And when you do that, you also create a situation where I bring $5,000 from somewhere, and then I'm in money because currencies at the local level has been devalued. So that gives undue advantage to countries that are high up there, economically speaking. Now, so these prescriptions that are brought up by the World Bank and the IMF actually further spread the dominance of the countries, the advanced countries of the world, who are economically, very buoyant.
And there's also the problem with pricing, so that the cocoa farmer in one state in Nigeria or somewhere in Ghana who produces his cocoa, if he wants to sell that cocoa on the international market, he has no say in how much he wants to sell it for. The price is determined by the global powers. So also, when he wants to now bring in the end products of the cocoa, they also determine the price. Is this all part of the neoliberalism and globalization work?
It's part of the policies that is used to promote the neoliberal agenda. It gives you the neoliberal gives you a false impression that, well, we're doing trading, it's a partnership, but that's not what it is. It's very clear, like you said, that when African countries who have been incorporated forcefully, not on their own terms, into the international economic system as raw materials, bring in their products, they do not have any control over the price. Now, that definitely gives an undue advantage to countries that are already very powerful. Now, and when this industrialized nation brings in their own finished products, industrial goods into the third world, they have control over the price. That tells you already that the balance of trade between these nations will favor some nations, will favor those who are powerful. And it also means that it's a process that will continue to impoverish, the poor nations of the world and enrich the rich nations of the world. It's a very unfair system.